reach across time and see yourself. You stand tall against terrifying enemies. You build masterpieces and break down barriers. You rush into the future and meet your past. For every time, at every moment, the official network of every millennium. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
The Chinese began immigrating to the United States in the 1850s. They were desperate to improve their lives, and they came at a pivotal time in our country's development, helping to build the Transcontinental Railroad and cultivate California's farmlands. Yet, despite their talent and their hard work, Chinese immigrants faced widespread prejudice in America. About the only places that welcomed them were the Chinatowns that began popping up on the east and west coasts. These communities baffled the Americans with their focus on ancient Chinese arts, customs, and religious beliefs. But it was there that the immigrants could recreate the vital Chinese culture they had left behind. Join us now as the History Channel presents Chinatown, Strangers in a Strange Land.
Chinatown. Everyone has heard of it. Most of us have even been there. Whether to sample the food, watch a Chinese New Year's parade, or just to take in the colorful sights and sounds. But these places are more than quaint districts geared for the tourist trade. They are complex communities with unique institutions and traditions, and the home and workplace for millions of Chinese Americans. A people with deep roots in their community and culture.
You'd walk down the street and you could probably say hello to everybody that you saw. It was a really, really small town feeling in a large city.
When I was 3 days old, my mother brought me back to 11 Mott Street. I've either lived or worked there every day of my life, and that's 72 years ago.
The mystique of Chinatown, wanting to belong to someone who is from the same heritage as I, had led me to Chinatown.
Their ancestors came from one of the world's most ancient civilizations. From a country rich in history and tradition, they journeyed across the world to a new frontier, rich in little but opportunity. Excluded from most of those opportunities by a dark wall of prejudice, they were forced to settle in stifling tenements that came to be called Chinatown.
Why did the Chinese people pick this area? I could only gather that it was probably the cheapest place that they could find back then. Nobody really wanted it.
Yet they not only survived, but prospered, becoming one of the most successful immigrant groups in North America. They did it in part by tenaciously clinging to the legacy of their homeland, giving them the collective strength to withstand the assaults of a hostile society.
I don't doubt that every American of Chinese heritage feels some ties to China and want to have some contact with their homeland.
I just embrace it, and I feel pleased to be able to put that as one of my chips and say that's part of us.
I try to get the best from both cultures, both the Chinese and the American. And that's why I think those of us who are Chinese American are a unique hybrid.
It is this singular blend of influences that is responsible for maintaining the powerful allure of Chinatown. It is a world that is rarely seen, and even more rarely understood. This is Chinatown. In Chatham Square, in the heart of New York City's Chinatown, are two statues that quietly speak volumes about the traditions, values, and aspirations of the Chinese people. One is of Kung Tzu, better known to Westerners as Confucius, the great Chinese teacher and philosopher whose belief in self-cultivation is one of the cornerstones of Chinese civilization. Confucius had a deep and abiding faith that people could be improved through education. that ordinary human beings could rise above their circumstances and with hard work and patience shape their own destinies. The other statue is of a man who, unlike Confucius, is almost completely unknown in the West. Yet he has a singular place in Chinese history. He tried to change the tragic fate of millions of his countrymen by fighting a war against one of the largest and most cynical drug-dealing operations in history, and by so doing, unknowingly helped to shape the destinies of millions of others who ultimately came to North America. His name was Lin Zexu.
He is the person who defied the British and said, "No more opium, and if you bring any more, I will burn it." And he did that. He burned it and caused the Opium War, which China lost. However, he's a great hero, not only to the Chinese people, but to the Fujian. They take very great pride in what he did.
Desperate to break into the lucrative Chinese import market in the 1830s, British and later American merchants ruthlessly imported large quantities of opium into coastal Chinese cities. Though opium had been used for centuries in China for medicinal purposes, this new influx of the drug addicted many of its residents, and the British forced Chinese authorities, virtually at gunpoint, to permit the illicit drug trade.
This meant that the Chinese couldn't enforce their own laws, which called for death for people that were engaging in the drug trade. It meant that if the Chinese rose up and decided to stop it, it would be an act of war.
Completely overpowered by Western military technology, the Chinese lost the Opium War. The opium trade continued, further accelerating a process of economic and social decline that was particularly acute in the coastal areas of southern China.
There were floods which had ravaged the countryside. There wasn't enough food for people to eat. There were also very difficult economic conditions following the Opium Wars, where a number of port cities had been devastated, where trade had been disrupted, and where the government's power to effectively rule that portion of the Chinese coast had been completely circumscribed by the depredations of the foreigners. So what you have are all of these incentives to have large numbers of Chinese leave.
Then, 10,000 miles away across the Pacific, something happened that would provide a beacon of hope. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. As word of the discovery quickly spread to China, they called this new land Gamsan, Golden Mountain.
And so gold miners start leaving China from the coastal ports like Hong Kong or Fujian province or Guangdong. All of these people start coming to California.
This immigration was only one part of a larger pattern that saw Chinese moving all over the globe, to places like Southeast Asia and South America. During this time, tens of thousands of Chinese took the daring and heart-wrenching step of leaving their homeland for foreign shores. But unlike most other immigrants, they were not going permanently. They were sojourners, usually young men who had no hope of making a living in China, but planned to make their fortunes overseas, then return home to live in comfort. But the journey to Golden Mountain was filled with danger. One of the worst threats was posed by the dreaded pig traders, unscrupulous labor contractors who used methods that ranged from false promises to kidnapping to obtain Chinese workers.
By 1851-1852, large numbers of Chinese were being collected on the coast of China for shipment elsewhere to the world as cheap laborers, as coolies. The word actually comes from the Chinese term coolie, or bitter labor. All of them had been promised a trip to California and an opportunity to strike it rich, but that was not the intent of the people that were going to take them. Instead, they were being shipped to Peru to mine guano. They were being shipped to Cuba or to Hawaii to work in plantations under conditions of near slavery. In fact, the coolie trade was a slave trade in everything but name.
Tragically, few of the 150,000 coolies taken to work in South America and the Caribbean ever fulfilled their goal of reaching California. But even for those sojourners who escaped the pig traders, enormous challenges still lay ahead on their journey to Gold Mountain. One of them was finding a way to buy passage to America. The solution was something called the credit ticket system. The sojourner could secure a $100 ticket from Hong Kong to San Francisco for $125 on credit. Repayment of the debt was handled by agents in San Francisco with ties to the bookers in China. But no one could return to China without proof of repayment. For their $125, they received a 20-inch wide, 6-foot-long hardwood berth in the crowded hold of a ship, and 2 miserable meals a day to sustain them during their weeks-long journey. An illegal version of this system still exists today, run by Chinese smugglers called snakeheads.
A person is a facilitator for getting people out of the country. Let's say you get here, you want your sister to come, you want your brother to come, and you don't want to wait your 7 years for citizenship. You don't want to wait till you apply another 5-6 years for proper papers. You want them over before they die of old age.
The fees charged today by the snakeheads are generally up to $38,000 and more. In a chilling parallel with the coolie trade of the 19th century, the illegal immigrants are often forced to pay off their debt by working in sweatshops and other businesses for years at a fraction of the minimum wage.
They are sold off or auctioned to a restaurant owner as a washer or a laborer, and he buys his tariff. And so now the person works for the restaurant for maybe half his salary or a third of his salary, and the other 2/3, the store owner or the restaurant owner is gaining because that's the money he already paid up to the snakehead up front.
Today, these latter-day sojourners often come stuffed 15 or 20 at a time into cramped steel cargo containers with little ventilation, a single bucket for sanitary facilities, and nothing but bottled water and bags of junk food to sustain them on the 2-week journey across the Pacific. Others come in rusted freighters like the Golden Venture, which ran aground in Rockaway, New York in 1993, with over 400 Chinese immigrants aboard. Many of these people die in the squalid conditions. Yet pushed by economic difficulties at home and pulled by America's booming economy, they continue to come, just as their forefathers did during the 19th century. Despite the difficulties of their journey, during the first 5 years of the gold rush alone, some 40,000 Chinese landed in San Francisco. These strangers in a strange land would not only fill a crucial need for their labor, but play an essential role in building a nation.
Oh, Shenandoah, I long to see you. Oh, you roaring river, away, across the white Missouri.
The new arrival from China was confronted with alien sights and sounds. Nothing was even faintly familiar. What could he do? Where could he go? How could he manage? Yi Ah-Tai, Lani Ah-Tai Farkas's great-grandfather, arrived in San Francisco during the 1850s.
The oral history of my family says that Yi Ah-Tai arrived on a junk or Chinese ship in America, and when they arrived in San Francisco for the first night, he and his companions were huddled at a doorway of a building with no place to stay.
But help was available to Yi Ah-Tai. For unlike other immigrants to America, the Chinese arrived to find a complex support system already in place, one that still exists today. It's made up of a unique group of community organizations called associations, which even now are visible on almost any street in Chinatown. To the untrained eye, the associations appear to be little more than ornately decorated buildings, marked by a few Chinese characters, some flags, and a discreet nameplate at the door. But in reality, they are involved in nearly every aspect of life in Chinatown. They were an outgrowth of the fact that China is a land with nearly 800 local dialects, some of which are so different from one another that they are almost like completely separate languages.
In China, they had district associations as well. For instance, in Beijing, when a scholar from Canton would go to study to pass the exams, the people would know just from his dialect that he wasn't from that city, and they would take advantage of him. It was like a big city person taking advantage of a country cousin. So the importance of the district associations in Beijing was to provide an umbrella of security for those people that were from their province in China.
These associations were even more important in California, where the Chinese lacked any cultural connection to the existing society.
So when a Chinese laborer got off of the boat in San Francisco, just by speaking, a district association leader could tell which district association that laborer belonged in.
Among the many services provided by the district associations, one of the most important was arranging for shipment of their members' remains back to their village in China for proper burial, in the event of an untimely death overseas.
He would pay a membership fee, and that membership fee would guarantee that if he were to die in America, that his bones would be returned to China, so that their spirit wouldn't be wandering forever in the darkness of a foreign land.
As a result of this custom, temporary Chinese cemeteries were created to hold the sojourners' remains until their bones could be transported home. The inscription on what is left today of the Lone Mountain Cemetery, land originally gifted to the San Francisco Chinese community by Yi Ah-tai, reads, "Temporary resting place for sojourners from the district of Kongqiao." In addition to the district associations, there were several other types of organizations a newcomer could join, including groups that linked extended families. In contrast to the thousands of family names that exist in America, there are only about 100 for all of China's over 1 billion people. Indeed, because the rural Chinese tend to live in the same area their whole lives, it is common for virtually all the people of a village or district to share the same surname. Sojourners could also join associations with no family ties called tongs, a word that means hall or club, whose members often shared similar business interests.
For instance, like the Hip Sing Tong or the An Leong Tong, which operate on different areas in Chinatown, anybody of any family name can belong to a Tong.
And many of the members of the Tong are members of district organizations, family organizations. So we have people in the community who belong to many organizations, 4 or 5, and sometimes as many as 10.
Standing at the top of the organizational pyramid is a coalition of all the associations.
The one that people hear about in public generally is the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, which is an umbrella organization which is comprised of 60-odd members, within which are other associations, family associations, village associations, and fraternal organizations, and also some commercial establishments.
The association served as the framework for the Chinese communities which outsiders were already beginning to call Chinatown. These Chinese enclaves quickly became urban ghettos. For their residents, however, Chinatown could also be a haven, providing a small measure of refuge from the discrimination and prejudice of a hostile society. Once a Chinese immigrant had been to Chinatown and registered with the proper district association, he headed to the gold fields.
And so from San Francisco, he would go on to Sacramento and then Marysville. And then from Marysville, either he'd take a wagon or a stagecoach up to La Porte, which was one of the northern mines in the Sierra, and the town that my great-grandfather wound up in.
When they arrived, the Chinese joined thousands of other miners in the back-breaking labor of digging their claims. It was a type of work that, like the district associations, had deep roots in their homeland. Even today in modern China, there is a continuing economic reliance on manual labor and skilled craftsmanship. The most modern skyscrapers are likely to have had portions of their foundations dug by hand. And at massive projects like the Three Gorges Dam, thousands of workers with shovels and buckets can be seen working side by side with forests of state-of-the-art cranes and fleets of modern trucks. It's a unique contrast to Western eyes, but to the Chinese, it is the fabric of their society. Throughout Chinese history, their most valuable natural resource has been the extraordinary abilities of their people. It was the sweat, muscle, and skill of Chinese workers and artisans that produced the Great Wall. The 2,000-year-old Dujiangyan irrigation project, and thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers that were found in the first Qin emperor's tomb, and the other magnificent achievements of Chinese culture and engineering. This proud tradition was carried on by the Chinese in America. In the goldfields, however, the difficulty of the work was only one obstacle faced by the Chinese.
California collected more than $5 million, primarily from Chinese miners who were taxed for a right to mine that was given free to Caucasians. There were other ways of keeping the Chinese out of the mines as well. Lynchings, mob violence, brandings, whippings, beatings. All of these pushed the Chinese out of the established communities. Their only hope was to go to diggings that had been abandoned by the white miners. In this fashion, the Chinese were able to make money and to prosper to some level during the gold rush.
Yet even as most of the Chinese sojourners were toiling in the gold fields, others were finding new ways to make their fortunes, many of them within the confines of San Francisco's growing Chinatown. Among the first groups to arrive in Gold Mountain were Chinese merchants who saw in the teeming gold fields riches of another kind, those that could be made by supplying miners with all manner of commercial goods. Tangible evidence of this was unearthed when a high-rise at 600 California Street was built in what used to be the heart of Gold Rush Chinatown.
What we found was truly amazing, an immense site, the remnants of a Gold Rush era store dating from the height of the Gold Rush in 1851. One of the pieces that is on display is a large blue and white vase that was manufactured in the Imperial Pottery in Beijing. It's an absolutely spectacular specimen. It's the finest piece I've ever excavated. It was so exciting to find that, because obviously a piece like this would have been purchased for display in the home of somebody of means then as now.
The exquisite artisanship of these works reveals the remarkable culture the Chinese brought with them to America.
One of the things about archaeology at Chinese sites, or doing historical research with respect to the Chinese in America, that I find fascinating is the constant reminder of the great antiquity and continuity of that culture. The ceramics and other archaeological materials that we're excavating are in many respects no different than pieces you find from the Ming Dynasty or even earlier. And whatever historical period one finds themselves in, the Chinese have maintained this tremendous continuity of culture throughout the ages.
Undoubtedly, one of the most visible and enduring aspects of Chinese culture in America is their food. High in quality and relatively low in cost, it quickly caught on with the non-Chinese population, opening doors of opportunity for Chinese entrepreneurs that still exist today.
It, for some reason, always goes back to food with the Chinese people. And you walk outside, right, that's all they're doing. 90% of the economy that you see in Chinatown is food. And I guess that's because when you go someplace and you don't really have any other skill, You know, you can't become a radio announcer, a newspaper writer, or a broadcaster. What do? Well, I cook.
But food was more than a way for Chinese-American businessmen and their employees to make a living. It was, and still is, central to the entire Chinese way of life.
To Chinese, that is the essence of life, is to eat with friends and relatives. They will discuss family problems or mutual problems of the community. So every time we meet, it's always proper to invite them to have something to eat at either the meeting or a family gathering.
From Cantonese cuisine with its rich and delicate sauces, to the more fiery arrivals from Sichuan and Hunan, the many types of Chinese food reflect the astonishing variety of traditions in China, and a large part of the many cultural legacies the Chinese have brought with them to America. No matter what their differences, however, all of them share one thing in common: a heavy reliance on the freshest ingredients available. Many of the more traditional foods and dishes can only be found in the larger Chinatowns of New York and San Francisco.